part of the appeal of COBOR is from the operator standpoint, you kind of always have access to your data the same way, right? It doesn't matter when you're using COBOR. It doesn't matter who your service provider are, because like we're creating this translation layer on top of all the data, right?
So Alex, you have been a part of COBOR actually from the very beginning. You left, you came back. So just talk about getting involved from the very early days.
Yeah. So in the early days, when I joined, I think it was the second iteration. So COBOR was working on some drilling tool downhole.
It was the communications. It was the directional drilling.
Yeah, yep. That was the first bit. I wasn't part of that. When I joined, it was really kind of when we started to work on Sonic for ball drops. So
this is some of the surveillance work on the horizontal multi-stage fracturing tools.
So basically, they always use pressure there to make sure the ball is seated properly, all that jazz. And what we did is like we kind of added Sonic to confirmation, right? So at the time, they were just starting to develop that software. So when I joined, it was me and Hector at the time. It was kind of the two-man software team, and we kind of built that one from scratch. We had to hardware the sensors, but like what we're working on is like the interface for all our field techs to like put a laptop, connect to the hardware, and be able to look at the sound. Essentially, like you had to basically visually see everything that was occurring downhole,
because you were looking for basically when the shear pin would kind of shear off, because when the ball seats, the pressure builds, a shear pin goes, it opens up the frac port, and then you can start fracking that.
And you can actually hear everything. Like you could rolling, and then like it was almost like training our field hand to recognize like what each of those events actually sound like.
Could you actually hear just from the initial ball drop?
Yeah.
Like could you detect that as well?
Yeah. So we were doing like the launch all the way to the seat, right? So we had like kind of those like specific event, and I mean, as I'm talking in the past, but like we have clients that still use that technology today. Like when they're trying like new sleeves technology, stuff like that, and they want to see like, they want to confirm that it's working as designed when it's kind of the first time that they're trying it or something like that. Like a lot of times they'll call our guys with our Sonic tool to come and confirm some stuff.
So there's still is some of the Sonic jobs are still actually taking place here at COBOR.
Yeah, we were doing lots in Canada. We did lots in Alaska. Different places that still do that. So yeah.
So okay, so fast forward from here, you basically SmartPAD and collecting data from service providers during a frac job. How did things go from surveillance to getting into what COBOR is doing now with SmartPAD?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I remember at the time that I was working out of Edmonton, that was kind of an idea that was brewing already, right? A lot of our founders were more from the drilling world.
Yeah, a lot of directional drillers from Mexico, right?
Yeah, and then they were used to Pason, right, in drilling, and it was kind of ubiquitous. And then when we started getting involved on the completion side, they kind of realized that there's kind of no equivalent to what we have on Pason. Like, how do they operate? Like, they can't even comprehend how they were able to operate their business and stuff like that with because
the OSRs are basically, they've got a bunch of different service companies on a job, and they're trying to keep track of everything that's happening, but there was no real connection of what was going on.
There's no central point. So you had kind of disparate data sets. So both from like the office side had to deal with all sorts of different data sets from different service provider, and like you were saying, the operations on site, like everyone had their own app and running on their own thing. So you had to keep track of everything on everyone's, specific application or monitor or whatever.
Yep. Kind of siloed or fragmented data sets.
Yeah. And so that's when, the idea of like, what would be the equivalent of Pason completion. And then they got into the idea of like, well, in order to get the proper timeline of the entire pad, where you have sort of this central point that really kind of tracks the rest of the operation, you needed to have the frac tree digitized, right? Yep. That was kind of the key to unlocking that solution. And so this is where they really started hard, is digitizing the frac tree. That's the first thing that SmartPAD was essentially, right? Yep. It was a tool that you could just see your valve position and pressure points on the factory. And then after that, we started to bring in more of that third-party data. And that's close to where I got back, actually. So I had moved to Calgary for family reason, left Colbor in 2017. And then Colbor's, all the employees that were kind of split between Calgary and Edmonton at the time, they moved everybody to Calgary. Funnily enough, because like it was important that we were all in the office together, and then COVID happened about like 6 months after they moved. Yep. But after they moved to Calgary, Hector, who I worked with back then, like he knew I'd move here, and so he called me and said, "Hey, you want to come back? We're in Calgary now." And actually, we're kind of coming to the end of a contract where I was working on, and so kind of fit the timeline, the timing pretty well. And then I came back, and yeah, so when I came back, like we're really kind of we just started sort of really aggregating all those third-party services on site next to like, and connecting the data sets over to the factory data that we were collecting with our hardware. So that was 2020. So they really started to do that in 2019, I would say. Yep. And then 2020 is when I joined, and then we kind of been growing since then. Yeah. So
when you come back, what were some of the things that you actually started working on? Like, what was some of the stuff that was being developed? I don't know if it was on like the visualization side of with the data, if it was more of just, being able to actually get, better data and putting it all together. Like, what were you working on?
Yeah. When I started, like we were just moving from one version of the application to another. So changed the entire web stack at the time. So that was kind of the hot fire that I was working on. And a lot of things also, like there was a lot of manual labor in like our RTOC operation, essentially. When it came to like coming to pad, we were always kind of the last people that are there. So we never have a lot of time to get the operation started, right? So everything has to be in place. The data van has to be there. So you have like a window of a few hours to kind of get everything ready so that when they start fracking, system is online, everything is connected, everything is looking great. Like the thing that I worked on the most when I joined was really kind of that automation piece of like, what can we do that's not so manual intensive that we can automate so that we can accelerate the task that we need to do when we roll to site, especially for our RTOC operators that had to connect, like, because it's pretty hard, like out there, like when you're trying to get data from Frac or wireline, like a lot of times, like maybe it's a mud bus connection or a serial stream that just sends a bunch of comma separated values, and you have to know like which one they are. You have to assign which channel each of the numbers represent, so that you can then connect that through the rest of the platform.
So there's a hardware, but there's also a configuration of the software or the firmware or something like that to make this work.
So yeah, the software configuration when you get on the job, since like part of the appeal of Colbor is from the operator standpoint, you kind of always have access to your data the same way, right? It doesn't matter when you're using Colbor. It doesn't matter who your service provider are, because like we're creating this translation layer on top of all the data, right? The corollary to that is like when we roll to site, we have to translate the data from everything and everyone that we encounter out there. Like all those little mom and pop service codes, all those big major ones, like we've over the years kind of seen all of them. And every time like we face, here's something new, right? Here's something
you had to create, you basically had to build a data standardization just for Colbor to actually even work.
Exactly. Like, yeah, we had to establish this main translation layer that could integrate any data source from any service companies that we came across almost in real time, because a lot of time we'd roll out the site and, it's like, hey, like that's not the same configuration you guys had the last time. And then the guys on site's like, well, that's what I got. Like, good luck. And then just making it happen over and over again. And over the years, like we can establish the right patterns, the right software to kind of, like I said, like accelerate how we can put all of that together so that we're much more efficient when you get to site. So that was quite the journey. So that's kind of like part of building the value in the company is, having seen all that, having integrated everything that's out there. and making it seamless from the operator standpoint when it's time to drag their data into their systems.
Is it still the same deal even today that there's not a whole lot of time for SmartPAD to get actually set up, or has that changed at all?
That hasn't changed at all, actually. It's still kind of the same deal since well, it's just the way that the operations work, right? Because we typically set up in the data van. Data van is typically the last thing that gets to site. It's just the way that the operations are, right? So it's still kind of always a crunch time when we have to set up, but now it's much less of an issue than it used to be, just because of what we've developed. Like, we've just adapted to that over the years.
Yeah. What probably a lot of people don't know is, what's the size of the development team right now?
I always get this wrong. I think it's 18.
Okay, so there's 18 developers. So at some point, you guys made the decision to bring people in-house and actually build that team.
Yeah.
So what was the motivation, and how did you do it? Because that's pretty impressive.
Yeah. I mean, the motivation was twofold, right? I think first, there was a financial consideration. I think that it started to make a lot more sense financially to have our own internal resources here in Calgary. And second, it was a culture thing for me, honestly. We were moving more and more from like our kind of hardware firmware roots, more and more entrenched into being a software based company, right? Being a data company. And it's amazing how much of your IP, how much of your the enterprise value actually gets built into your people. And that's always kind of been my view of, especially in software organization, just because it's it's an intangible industry, right? It's like a lot of it is literally created out of nothing, out of someone's imagination, and when you write code. And so that's why I kind of like emphasize how important it was to have those people be part of our company, be, bought in and 100% cold bore. Also, the fact that we are working in a very specific industry where, there's always a portion of your efficiency, effectiveness as developers, a portion of it relates to how much you know about the subject matter, right? How much you know about the domain in which you're programming and you're working. And that's also like builds over time. And then like you can only reap the dividend from that when you have internal resources that you kind of basically build up.
Yeah. What I also find really interesting, so there's a product team, there's a hardware team, there's a software team, but then there's also the operations team. So how does this all work together? Because you've got a bunch of different groups that are all working together to kind of achieve the same mission, but it sounds like that there's got to be some complexity and some coordination, but actually having those teams, in-house, like that has to create value for customers at the end of the day.
Yeah, definitely like helps to have them in-house, because even having them in-house, like there's all sorts of orchestration issues. Simply from the fact that I always say that, Colbor is one of the most vertically integrated company that I work with, because we go from building our own hardware, deploying it to site ourselves, and then operating the software that goes on top of it, right? And delivering the data to the customer. So it's a very, very vast kind of area that we're covering. And so obviously having all the teams in house definitely helps that. Because that's always the main challenge, is like, as we grew in the past, we grew quite a bunch in the last 3 years. Really quickly, when you get past like 50 employees, I would say 50 is kind of the magic number. When we past 50 employees, this is where like, we cannot just talk in the corridor when we decide we're going to do something, right? Because like everything else kind of unravels, because we don't think about our second, third, fourth order consequences. You have to have more of a hive mind created, and obviously creating that hive mind and that focus on the mission and on like having the same objectives constantly. Like you need to have like every leader really well aligned. It's
transitioning from that startup mentality to like a real corporation.
There's a bit of that, right? We're obviously not trying to go too far, because like, there's so many things that we get from having a still pretty nimble organization. There's always kind of this thing like, you know, we're a real company now, so we have to do X. I don't think this is necessarily true. I think we get an edge versus like some of the companies that we're competing with that are much bigger than us, because like we're much more nimble, because we have a, you know, time from decision to execution to completion is much smaller for us than for a lot of other companies. So we definitely try to keep this alive in our organizational structure. And that kind of comes through a bit of we always trying to, as we build that team of software engineers, for example, like really focus a lot on like decentralizing decision making. So that way, that's a way that we found that may sound obvious, but a lot of software companies get this wrong, where, you know, trying to have more of a top-down approach to things. We're pretty decentralized in how we operate. You have, you know, kind of define the verticals between each of our software team. They have their product owners, they have their subject matter expert that work with them, but they're the one that we're trying to constantly interact with the customer, interact with other users, internal or external. And they understand the pain points better than a lot of people. And we give them a lot of, I mean, obviously like some stuff will draw from sales, but there's also a lot of like problems that we let our engineer teams solve because they know firsthand that it needs to be solved. And that allows us to kind of grow organically as well, without having to have a lot of management overhead and stuff like that.
Well, hey, speaking about growth, because we were talking about this, and there's been some speculation that there's going to be some growth that's happening over the next year. How do you approach growth at Cold Bore? Because as more clients come on board, there's more demand, and how do you scale SmartPAD to cater to that demand?
Well, I mean, it got easier, and I say that because like by our last growth spurt, you know, when we went from like we doubled revenue every year, like from 2020 to 2022, and that was during peak COVID, and all the supply chain were just, for lack of a better
disaster,
clusterfuck, right? So today, like things are a little easier. So we have it a little more like, because I remember like I was working with Craig Bergman, he's our director of hardware, and we're working together when we were planning some of the, you know, we're planning for our growth, and you know, week to week, our supply chain timelines and costs would change, right? Now it's got a little bit more sane. So we've also established good relationship with suppliers over the years, right? So we know what we need. We know where to draw it from. We know how much time it takes. But we're also, you know, we're looking to different partnerships with service companies. Because at the end of the day, like there's a lot of overlap, more and more, especially like when you see those digital factories out there, right? Like I said, I always say that, you know, for us, Digitizing the factory is more of a loss leader than anything, because we needed to digitize the factory to do what we do, right? Everything that we've built is based around the existence of those sensors on the factory. And so when we roll out there and we have more and more of those smart factories that are taking over the market, like it allows us to deploy to those sites with a much smaller footprint. And that's definitely like help our growth, because we don't have to build the entire equipment for all 100% of the sites that we're rolling on. So that's a bit of a help in terms of the growth phase. And the other thing is always, you know, hiring, you know, anytime, everybody you're going to talk to that's ever been in business, like, especially when you hear it, but I'm sure it's always been true, like finding good people is always a challenge. Like we're blessed with a lot of great people here at Cold Bore, and you still have to be careful. Like, you know, you always don't want to hire the right people over the right mindset. We're very, very protective of our culture. So that's probably one of the bottleneck that we have to watch for, is to make sure that we have enough people in the pipeline to serve all those customers.
One thing that I think a lot of people are not aware of is that there has been a core team here at Cold Bore that has been around like from the very beginning. So 10 plus years ago, almost the entire team from Inseco joined Cold Bore. There's so many people that have been around from the very beginning of this company, and they're still here. So can you just speak to this? Like, what is it that keeps people around so long? Because I'm just thinking, Blair's been around since the beginning. Nikolai and I think Hector's been here, I think, since the beginning. He was back at Inseco. And
Craig.
Yeah. So what is it about what's going on at Colbor that is exciting, that's keeping people here for 10 plus years?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the camaraderie. Like, it's really that. There's a portion, I think, that's Blair. Blair as a leader, like, he's our CFO here, and he's someone that everyone trusts intrinsically, and that people wanted to follow, and that still want to follow today, right? And these guys, we're working with them at Inseco, decided to move over here with them again, and then they've built kind of this kind of. Yeah, the camaraderie. Like, I don't say family because I know it's kind of silly, but it's kind of it's the closest thing that you can get to that when it comes to workplace. Yeah, and that's so much value, right? When you can come in every day to work, working with people you enjoy working in, like everything seems to just fall naturally after that, right? And I think these guys have built that over the years, and that's why they're still here.
So one thing that I've heard, and I've heard this from multiple people, a lot of people really love your leadership style. So what does it mean to be a leader? Like, what does leadership mean to you, and how do you approach it here at Colbor?
That's an interesting one. It's funny because it's not the first time that I get asked that question, and every time I have a hard time answering it. I don't think I have a style that. I don't know if I can put a word on it. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's not like I over the years I was like, oh yeah, like I'm gonna pick that style. Like, it's got a good definition. I can follow the pattern. It's more been evolving all the time. My leadership style is, I would say, I think I'm pretty hands off, honestly.
So you're not the micromanager?
No, absolutely not. Right. I like to talk about the mission and what we're trying to do, and really outcome driven. I would classify it as and trusting the people that have the task to execute with the execution. Like, I think that's probably the basics of it. Like, I like to stay detached from a lot of the day-to-day work, because I think it allows me to see the forest from the trees a lot of times. And so when I get involved with our team, they show me what's happening, they show me what's going on. I'm always in the position where I can say, like, what about X, right? And people are like, wow, we didn't think about X. But it's not because I'm a genius. It's just because I just not been knee deep into this problem for the last 3 weeks.
You can you have some objectivity. You're not into the weeds, or you're not into the details like they are.
Yeah. And that allows me to bring in just that outsider's perspective every now and then. And that's been one way that I've been going at it. I mean, I've got more of a, so I have to boil it down to one thing, and it's something that I saw a while back that kind of resonated with me, I guess, after the fact, is so there's farmer's mentality, right? Where it's more like how I'm looking at leadership, more like a farmer. You don't yell at the crops, like, it's gonna grow faster, right? You got to get rid of the weeds. You got to feed them what they need to grow. You got to treat them well. And, sometimes the weather is going to, wreck your season.
Yep.
And there's a lot of things you can't control, but what you can control is all those outside things, right? It's think about all the risks around what could occur, and what are your contingencies, so that everything that happens, you have an idea of how to go about this and address whatever comes your way. And yeah, that's literally
creating the environment, to allow things to grow. You don't have to grow it. You just have to create the conditions.
Yeah. It's so silly because I remember when I was just an individual contributor, I would hear leaders say the same type of thing. And I was kind of wow, dude,
yeah.
But it's literally how it is, right? It's it's actually challenging to keep an environment that's good for employees to grow, for employees to be happy. But it's also very rewarding, but it's not it's it takes care of itself. I think it is a leader's responsibility or main responsibility. And I think that's what the micromanagers, I guess, get wrong.
Yeah. So we are going to be doing a different video on APR, but could you introduce what is APR, and can you tell a little bit about, because I think we're at a point where cold bore is 100% APR deployed. So what is it, and what's the value to customers?
Yeah. So APR has been it's been 2 years in the making, actually.
What does it stand for?
Auto path recognition. So, in fracs, like you have what we call our critical path, right? So you have your timeline around each of your well, and, you're fracking from well to well to well, wireline for well to well to well. And then you kind of like, we call them those time blocks around the timeline for each of those wells, and like those are kind of all inferred from the data, right? And in the past, like when we all started, it was kind of like our field techs or like a company man would have to type that in from the actual operation happening in the field.
And what do they do? They're basically tracking valve positions and what's kind of going on, and they're logging that on site.
Yeah, they say, okay, the valve opened at this time, it closed at this time, pressure dropped to here, so that means we're fracking from this time to this time, punch that in, boom. And that was already kind of an evolution from like the Excel spreadsheet, right? Where you didn't even have like your valve position to guess. So like people were guessing at a 5 to 15 minute, difference of, I think it was 8:05.
Yeah.
So that was kind of like originally how it worked. But then, all those events can actually be tracked through the data, right? And it wasn't like an easy feat at all, but like that's kind of what we started to work on. Is like, well, then since we started to gather all the data and we had like a big data set from like plenty of jobs that we've done in the past, then we had like kind of a statistically significant data set to work with in order to build an algorithm that was able to track that timeline automatically, just through the data feeds that we're getting without any human intervention when it comes to all the productive time. So, when everything goes, according to plan, the algorithm is going to pick it up, it's going to put it on the timeline. And then like it only basically for the person running the operation, the only have to interact with that piece of the system when something goes wrong, and like sit it down for weather, like lightning strike, like stuff like that you're never probably ever gonna be able to just catch through a sensor. But that limits the amount of cognitive load on the person running the operation. It also streamlines and I don't know what's the word, but it creates consistency, like in the data set for the time log, so that anyone that draw from that data later and do some analysis on it, like they know that it's not because Bob logs it this way and Joe like does it differently, like because since it's algorithmic based, there's much more reliability in the data in that way.
So you can be comparing pads to pads. So you can be comparing how maybe zones are taking different treatments that you're doing. You can be tracking different service providers, probably because you're creating greater consistency at the end of the day. You can use that data for all sorts of purposes.
Yeah, because if you're trying to track your pumping efficiency, but like two guys consider like frac, like one say it's when the valve open, and one say when the pressure is steady, like they all have their own interpretation of when frac start is. Like when you use APR, you have this consistency across the board, so you can have like 2, 3, 4 service companies running in parallel and looking how they're performing next to each other, and it's actually apple to apple comparison in that case.
So what are you hearing from the operations teams, the people who are dealing with customers at the end of the day, the business development team members? What are customers saying? What are they liking? What are they not liking, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's kind of different from regions to regions almost. And it's different, I would say, from generations to generations also. I think you have a lot of guys that have been doing this for a very long time that see it as a toy, and like they'll always see this as a toy, right? Well, you have like more like the technology minded, younger generation, or not necessarily a generational thing, but just generally like younger people tend to be more technology oriented. And then they see they're like, yeah, obviously we need that, right? You work anything anywhere else, or you interact with anything like that you're doing $1 million operation around, you'd have something like this to track everything and make sure that everybody sees everything in real time, and everyone can dig into that data later, and everything can push that through their machine learning algorithms or whatever data science project that they have to work on afterward. Like that, you know, for some people it's obvious, and from others, from like a purely operational standpoint, it's not. But I would say like really the value is in the data, right? Yeah. And that's what I think, you know, when you think that like that deploying Cold Bar on a site doesn't bring value operationally. I mean, it does to a certain degree. It gives you observability. It increases safety, a bunch of things like that. But when it comes to value creation, I think it's that the ability to bring that data into, as an operator, as a customer, like the ability to bring that completions data that is reliable into the backbone of your organization and make it available to your completions engineers, make it available to your reservoir engineers, make it available to the data science teams that are ramping up right now with everything that's going on around the next generation of AI that's come to the surface in the last few years, almost a year. Yep. That's where like a lot of the value is, and then, you know, you have to be a little bit technology oriented to recognize that. Yeah.
So what do you think customers can expect to see from Cold Bar over the next year? What do you think is going to happen?
I mean, over the next year, I think one of the things that we're looking into right now is like, how do we loop that? Like I always talk to our engineers about the loop, right? And they'll hear me rant about that, but essentially is kind of, you have kind of this first iteration of the loop where, you know, you have atoms and you have bits, right? And that's our business. Like we kind of create the map of everything that happened in the world of atoms into the worlds of bits. And we've been working on that for the past 4 years, is really creating a really good map of reality that is digitized, that can be leveraged by digital systems. So, you know, we do a little bit of development on that analytics piece, and we're going to continue to kind of work on that over the year, and you'll see more and more of those things coming together, because like I said earlier, we got to a point where we have such a statistically significant data set to work from that we can start looking at things like, how's the average look for that basin or for that region in that county, right? And start to provide the customer with like some of that insight.
Almost like kind of predictive analytics in a way, based on...
Necessarily predictive, but it's more like, you know, if you're operating a basin and like a bunch of wells were fracked and you actually happen to have the production data for those wells, knowing if they were doing well or not, and you know how they were fracked, like it's probably going to give you some insight into how you should frack that well, right? And then the other piece is, you know, one of the new questions, and then kind of in our future that we're looking to bring to our customers, like how do you move, because you have to find your way to move back from the bits back to the atoms, right? Because like it's one way to move and digitize and create that digital map, and
you got to turn it into applied information. You have to make an end result happen.
It's got to be kinetic at the end of the day, right? So how do we move from the bits back into the atoms? And that's a bit of the theme that I'm challenging our engineers on, like going into next year. You know, something like, you know, we're trying to bring plan data, for example, from customers, so that, you know, when you're running your operation, you can see your frac design, and stage after stage after stage, you can see how the frac has been going versus design in real time. And then you can involve your frac engineers from the office in real time as well. And that's one way to bring...
Because the design now can start it can take advantage of the information of, here's what the actual result happens in the real world. We need to maybe modify our design because in a particular basin, maybe things aren't working the way that we thought they would. This is the information we get. Let's try something else and utilize that data.
And sometimes even simpler than that. And like sometimes it's even like, you know, maybe the operations have not been following like necessarily what the design of those wells were.
Now there's accountability.
Yeah, now it's like stage of a stage. You're gonna get a report, and even in real time, when you're gonna like get that rate up, there's a bar here that says like what's supposed to be the rate on that stage. So it's not only accountability, but it's also just machine assistance,
Yep.
right? For the operation, and the other thing that we're starting to do with some of our most advanced operators that we're, all the information that, when I talked earlier about APR, like when we create those time blocks automatically on the critical path, like it's all based on events that we detect, right?
Yep.
Key events that are key part of any completions operation. Like we're starting also to like put that on the wire so that we can start to have interaction with service companies that have other smart system on site that can, leverage the information in real time. So that's another thing that's what we're being rolling out before the end of this year, actually.